Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 3 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Ottawa Senators, in which the Sharks have won 2-1. So the Sharks now 3-0 undefeated to start this season, and this, to use a very popular hockey cliche, this was a pretty solid road game, all things considered, for the San Jose Sharks. This one starts off, and the Sharks, I would say, were controlling the majority of the puck possession, of the offensive zone time, though not really getting many chances for themselves. But it was a crucial mistake in the neutral zone by Erik Karlsson that would allow the Ottawa Senators to get a 2-1 and get them their only goal, what would stand as their only goal this game, coming from Drake Batherson. The Sharks would appear to have tied the game up off of a beautiful snipe from Kevin Labanc. However, the Sharks would be offside, called for offside, on the challenge by the Senators just a few seconds earlier, and as such, after 20 minutes, it would be the Senators with the 1-goal lead. However, this is not the first time that the Sharks will have trailed this season, and it is not the first time that the Sharks would end up making the comeback after trailing this season, as early in the second period, it would be the captain Logan Couture scoring his first goal of the season to tie the game up at 1. Eventually, as the period would go on, the Sharks would get a power play, and Labanc would manage to get his goal back on the board with his second straight power play goal in that many games. And it was another beautiful shot from the Ovechkin office area on the power play. Labanc has actually shifted between this year and previous years on the power play. Usually he would play along the half wall in more of an assist area, but that spot has now been filled by William Eklund on that second power play unit, and as such, now Labanc plays in the more Ovechkin area, and he's been absolutely thriving in that particular role. Now, as I said, 2 straight games with power play goals, and both extremely similar types of goals that he scored. In the third period, it would be the Ottawa Senators completely controlling the pace of the game. The Sharks were kind of just sitting back and hoping for this 1-goal lead to stand, and luckily for them, it did do so. 20 minutes go by, no goals for either side, and the Sharks get the victory to remain undefeated. Moving on to the players to talk about here, we will once again start on this first line with Meier, Couture, and Dahlin, who were once again the Sharks' best line of the game. This is coming as no surprise to anybody. Couture and Meier, I thought, were both very, very good. Couture in particular stood out once again as probably the Sharks' best player in general in this particular game. When I talk about Dahlin, in the first couple of games of this season against the Jets and the Canadiens, it really felt as though he was sort of the third member of this line and doing a very good job at that. Here tonight, it felt as though Couture and Meier were kind of carrying him a bit in that regard. Bit of an off game for Dahlin, at least in comparison to his line mates, but still, as a whole, this line still very much succeeding. But once again, as was the problem in the previous game against the Montreal Canadiens, it is the other 9 forwards who just haven't necessarily shown up that much, at the very least at even strength. When I take a look at this second line, Hertl I thought was pretty good defensively in this game, but just not really getting much generated offensively. Same would go for Balcers and, of course, for William Eklund as well. Eklund would technically add another assist to his total, now with 3 assists in his 3 games played. But there was definitely an interesting stat to talk about when it comes to William Eklund, is that he ended up with just 10.5 minutes of ice time in this game. And a decent chunk of that was actually on the power play. If you were to take a look at even strength ice time, he would actually be the Sharks player with the second lowest even strength ice time in this particular game, with just over 9 minutes. And this is not really a great thing for a player who is, a top 6 player, or is at least being played in a top 6 position at this point, because the player who was last in terms of even strength ice time was Jasper Weatherby, the 4th line center. But when your second line winger is getting this little even strength ice time, that is a bit of a problem, especially since Eklund is this extremely young player who you didn't necessarily want to rush to the NHL level, and yet him sitting here playing 10 minutes a night is not necessarily a recipe that the Sharks want to be able to develop Eklund into an all-star player that he does have the talent to be. You see, every NHL team, when it comes to these very, very young rookie players, is given the option where after 9 games of their first year of their entry-level contract, they are given the option of sending them down to the AHL, not playing them any more games for the rest of the season, so that they can delay the burning of their first year of their entry-level contracts. And so, over these next few games, the Sharks will be faced with the tough decision of whether or not they want to send Eklund down to the Barracuda and not burn the first year of his entry-level contract, or if they want him to remain with the San Jose Sharks and burn that first year. And from my perspective at this point, even though there have been some very nice plays, and this game was no exception, there was this one play in particular in the defensive zone that I thought he showed off some really nice stick handling and smooth skating to be able to clear this puck out of the zone pretty much single-handedly. However, it's just not really a consistent thing that we see over 60 minutes. And so this can definitely change over these next 6 games, which is how many games there are left before this decision must be made by Doug Wilson and the Sharks staff. However, in my opinion, it seems to be trending more towards a situation where you probably do want to send him down to the AHL, let him play 18, 19, 20 minutes per game in that particular area, and really allow him to rise and shine into the next season. But I guess it is pretty early in the season to say that. Still only a third of the way through those 9-game window that the Sharks do have. Onto the third line, which I thought was likely the Sharks' second best line here tonight, and actually rather close to the Meier, Couture, Dahlin line compared to how it was in the previous game against the Canadiens, where nobody was even touching, even in breathing distance of that first line. This third line I thought was actually pretty good. They definitely looked a bit more on the same page here tonight. At the very least, they were in the same book compared to the previous game against that Montreal Canadiens squad. I thought LeBanc had a very, very solid night offensively as well, not just because he scored this power play goal, because he did score a power play goal in that previous game, and yet his night in general wasn't great. Here tonight, though, definitely much better. Nick Bonino as well, I thought was much improved from the previous game and showing off some nice defensive skill, and even Matt Nieto definitely seemed to have taken a bit of a step forward after a bit of a step back in the previous one against the Canadiens. So just all in all, a solid game from the Sharks' third line. When it comes to the fourth line, however, I must say that besides the one bright spot of Andrew Cogliano, who I find is just a very hard-working player who seems to give it 100%, 110% even on every single shift, I have not been particularly impressed with either Jasper Weatherby or Lane Peterson. I'm a bit willing to give Weatherby a bit more pull where he can stay in the lineup for a couple of more games, but even though the Sharks have now won 3 straight, I really would not be opposed to getting Lane Peterson out of the lineup. The Sharks were heavily promoting the sort of competition factor coming into this season, where the Sharks want to get a lot of different players in and out of the lineup, and I know the Sharks are obviously winning games, so you don't want to change a working formula. However, Lane Peterson has not really been a part of that winning formula. Really, only the first line has. So would it be the end of the world to get him out, especially to try and get a player like Gadjevich, who of course was picked up off of waivers from the Vancouver Canucks, try to get him a game to try and get him acclimated to what the San Jose Sharks are, since when you're playing on the fourth line, you're not necessarily a massive piece of the team. You're not going to be a massive liability necessarily, because you're not going to get a ton of ice time. It's just that Lane Peterson has not really impressed me all that much. Moving on to the defensive side of things, once again, I thought Ferraro and Burns had a pretty solid game. On the other hand, I thought both Middleton and Karlsson left a bit to be desired. It was actually this very funny stretch of play, which was a 4-on-4, which would eventually actually lead to that Kevin Labanc called off goal. It was a 4-on-4, and of course, since Shemek and Vlasic aren't necessarily great options to play 4-on-4, we saw a shift of Ferraro and Burns, and then we saw a shift of Karlsson and Middleton just looked completely lost in the much more open 4-on-4 type of play. He just seemed to me very indecisive in his plays, and that was something that was obviously very, very common in Jacob Middleton's game prior to this season. I thought otherwise, throughout the game at actual 5-on-5 play, Middleton wasn't awful, but definitely has been kind of trending downhill from where he was in that first game of the season. Karlsson, on the other hand, this is just kind of a thing that you've come to accept with Erik Karlsson. He's just a player who has absolutely made a name for himself by taking these very, very aggressive plays in the neutral zone, trying to step up and get the puck going the other way, and sometimes it works out quite well. Like there was this nice play where he knocks a puck down pretty much at center ice to prevent Stützle, who was standing right behind him, from getting a decent one-on-one break against Jacob Middleton. But then, of course, there's the other side of the coin where we saw on this goal that the Ottawa Senators did score. He kind of chases Brady Tkachuk at center ice. Tkachuk just kind of sends a pass through him for the 2-on-1, and Batherson ends up putting it behind James Reimer. So it's a bit of give and take with Erik Karlsson, who has been good offensively at the very least in this season, as I believe now he has 5 points in these 3 games, but I would like to see a bit more consistency in the defensive play. When it comes to the third line, one player who I do really want to talk about for this game would actually be Marc-Edouard Vlasic. After a pretty rough start to this season in that game against the Winnipeg Jets, which just was not particularly good at all, he's definitely been a lot more solid here tonight and in the previous game against the Montreal Canadiens, which is very nice to see. Obviously, he's not getting a ton of ice time, and he's not getting the toughest shifts in the world, getting those 14 to 15 minute games and against third or fourth lines. But if that's the role that you're going to play Marc-Edouard Vlasic in, at the very least, you're hoping for him to excel in that role, and excel he has been doing over these past couple of games. So it is still nice to see that Vlasic does have some defensive elements to his game still. When it comes to Radim Shemek, one thing that I do want to point out about him is how his game has kind of evolved this season. Radim Shemek has always been a player who at first I had always thought was a defense first type of player, because obviously when he burst onto the Sharks scene playing with Brent Burns on that first pairing, when you're playing with Brent Burns, you have to be the more defensively responsible player on that pairing, because of course Burns is going to be the more offensively oriented player on whatever pairing he's with. That's exactly what Ferraro has also had to adapt to over these past couple of seasons. But for whatever reason now, maybe it's because he's been playing with Vlasic, who of course is also very defensively minded, Shemek has seemingly added this sort of offensive element to his game, and of course it's nowhere near as developed as you would expect from a Brent Burns or an Erik Karlsson, but he's definitely been stepping up a lot more in the the neutral zone, and it hasn't actually been working all that bad. So the fact that this third pairing always seemed to be one that would be very, very defensively minded, and you would expect to just kind of be clearing pucks out and not really much would be happening in the offensive zone with these two on the ice. I have appreciated that Shemek has somewhat stepped up in this particular area, and I wonder if this was actually a Sharks staff decision to try and get Shemek to actually do this. If they told him that, you're going to be playing on a pairing all year pretty much with Marc-Edouard Vlasic, and if you want to be able to keep that spot in the lineup, you need to kind of step up the game slightly offensively, because he definitely has been getting more aggressive in that area. And finally, I should be talking about, James Reimer. It says Adin Hill there, but he did not actually play in this game. He will get the game tomorrow against the Toronto Maple Leafs. Reimer, a bit of a rough start to this one. This was actually, the Ottawa Senators' only goal was actually on the second shot of the game, and this was one that Reimer definitely should have been able to save. Obviously, it's very easy to talk about on a 2-on-1 where you say, the goalie should be playing for the shot and it's the defenseman who should be playing to block the pass. Obviously, when you're the goaltender, you still want to be kind of not necessarily fully cheating for the pass, but you're kind of half cheating to try and make that big save if that pass does come across. Reimer, you could say he does that a bit and ends up letting in a bit of a weak goal to Batherson. However, he definitely rebounded after that, kind of like how we saw from Adin Hill in that first game of the season against the Winnipeg Jets. Reimer was then stellar for the rest of the game, not really giving up too many rebounds, not really giving up too many second and third opportunities for the Ottawa Senators, and generally locked things down. And once again, it is a second straight game here where the Sharks get an incredible performance from their goaltender. While in the previous one, they didn't necessarily need it from Hill because they managed to put up 5 goals. Here tonight, they definitely needed it from Reimer, and that's exactly what they got. So that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action, as I said, tomorrow. They're going to be taking on the Toronto Maple Leafs. Definitely going to be their biggest challenge thus far. Not only are they on the second half of this back-to-back, after, of course, this tough game against the Ottawa Senators, but the Toronto Maple Leafs are likely far and away the best team that they're going to have faced at this point this season. The Jets were expected to be pretty good, but haven't necessarily come out the gate too well. The Canadiens are still struggling absolutely. The Senators are okay and have had an okay start to the season but aren't great, but the Toronto Maple Leafs are expected to be a playoff team, are expected to be a top 3 team in their respective division, and so this will be a true test for the San Jose Sharks, and we'll see if they can put up a respectable performance in that game. Class dismissed.